used to stand up and tell stories, right? And I still remember the nigun. How's it go? And in between, you would tell the story and then come back to the chorus of the nigun. Why did you choose to tell stories instead of give a Devar Torah or something like that? What's the power of the story in that scenario? And more broadly, about tell us a little about the literary device of a story.
So the story itself is really interesting because now I learned the technique I learned because of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, because at one point in his life, what he decided to do was instead of just giving didactic lessons, just give lessons and speak and speak and speak, what he decided to do was that he decided to tell stories. And the question is, why did he decide to tell stories? I mean, of all the things to do, telling stories is not, generally what, Hasidic rabbis would do, they would generally speak. But he decided to tell stories, and the reason that he decided to tell stories is because, as you and I know, what the story is very engaging. And what happens is that when somebody tells the story, it's the listener becomes a part of the story itself, becomes a part of the storytelling. And so in a story, generally what happens is that we find ourselves someplace in that story. And so as we begin to listen to the story, we begin, our imaginative faculty begins to start working. And so what happens is that we take the story and we internalize that story, and we internalize the lesson of the story appropriately to each and every one of us. So this story, we all know that whenever there's a speaker and he wants to make a point, and he has a good story, then we all know that somehow we really get the point. The story is so engaging and gets our imaginative faculty moving and thinking that it really begins to, it gives the person who's telling the story the opportunity to really engage the people that are around him. One of the reasons that I generally told the story, and I used to tell the story around Sudat Shlichit in the afternoon, when, of course, it was getting dark, and we would begin with a nigun, which also, of course, gets people into the mood to listen to a story. And so what happens, it becomes a powerful tool in order to educate, the people that you really are dealing with. And it also, what it does is it forms the circle so that people are engaged and they're really listening together, even though everybody in the circle is really getting something differently from the story.
All right, one more question about the literary device, and then we'll move on to Rabbi Nachman. Right, Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? Yetziat Mitzrayim is a story. We tell the story.
Right.
And two things about that. One is, I remember sometimes on Friday nights, you used to offer Divrei Torah or Torah at our Orthodox community. And occasionally you'd get into a little bit of hot water because you would refer to the Torah as a literary work and use literary technique on the Torah, literary analysis, and so tell us a little bit about that, is the Torah as a story and the power of looking at it as a story.
Well, a couple of things. One is you have to invite me back. Another time I'll talk about reading the Bible as
you're gunning for a third one. Okay. We can...
but very quickly, God, in his great wisdom, or in her great wisdom, what happened is that God decided that he was going to give stories, a narrative, instead of just giving laws. And so what happened is that once God decides to give the Torah as a story, that means that we have to then try to treat the biblical story as a real story. And so you have to begin to apply literary techniques, which would be things like trying to, who are the characters and what do the characters have to say, and how do you deal with the various characters, or how do you deal with literature which which is repetitive literature. In a lot of the stories, as an example, you have the woman who cannot have children, and then God ultimately listens and she has children. Why do they choose that kind of theme? So the theme of the story and trying to uncover the layers of the stories, the stories of the Torah are like an onion, that you really have to uncover the layers of the story in order to find its meaning, which is hidden, really hidden inside. The other thing is, Rebbe Nachman, by the way, once asked a very interesting question. And the question is, he says that if you take a look at the liturgy for Rosh Hashanah, it's an interesting, the liturgy is very interesting, especially during the Musaf, the additional service. The Musaf service never asks God for anything. What the Musaf service does is tells us stories and refers to greater stories that we have within the Bible. And it is through the retelling of those stories on a yearly basis that we ultimately get what the ultimate meaning of those stories are, and of course the ultimate meaning for our life.
Beautiful. And all right, let's get into it. So tell us a little bit about your relationship with Rebbe Nachman, including your trip to Uman.
Okay, so what happened was when I was at Shaarei Tzedek and the educational youth director, one day a young man by the name of Natan Maimon came by, and he was a Breslover chassid, but he was dressed like you and I, and we started to talk. And I said to him, would you be willing to come and meet with our 12th graders for a senior seminar? And he agreed. He agreed almost right away. And what he decided to do was to speak about the creation in light of Jewish mysticism and in the light of the way Rebbe Nachman of Breslov understands the creation of the universe, which is very different than the story that you have in the Bible. So starting then, I developed a relationship with Rabbi Maimon, a relationship, by the way, that we continue to this very day. It's a relationship which has lasted probably almost 25 years. And I still learn with him. And what I began to do is to get interested in Breslov materials. And I really found that a lot of the ideas which Rabbi Nachman had, and those are basically radical ideas, and since I'm a bit of a radical when it comes to Jewish thought, we sort of clicked with each other, and some of the ideas of Rebbe Nachman are really ideas which I took. So when I was given the opportunity to go to the Soviet Union, my wife and I, Judy and I, went to the Soviet Union to teach, and when we went on the trip, what happened was.
What year?
I'm sorry?
What year was that?
Around 1980, when the Iron Curtain was just lifting. It still hadn't lifted. In fact, we got into trouble leaving the Soviet Union. We almost never got out of the Soviet Union, but thank God things worked out. So what happened is I told Ray Sharfman, who was head of the Detroit Committee for Soviet Jewry, that I would go on the condition that I could actually go to Uman. And so I arranged that we would go, when we went to Kiev in order to teach, that after teaching, I would go to Uman. And so what happened was we had a driver, and I had to have an in-tourist guide who traveled together with us, and we left Uman, and it's not very far from Kiev to Uman. It must be we would say it would be about an hour's drive. And what happened was actually was like a 4-hour drive because of the road conditions. I think things may be much better now, but the conditions were very poor. And at that time, the grave of Rabbi Nachman was outside of the house of a peasant who lived in the Ukraine. And what happened is that you would go there and you would go to this house, and he would meet with you. You would give him some money, and he would allow you to pray at the grave of Rabbi Nachman. In fact, I think we could try to get it so you could see it, but actually here's a picture of me. I look a little different. This is a picture of me at the grave of Rebbe Nachman, and that's what it was in those days. It was just in the backyard of this guy's house. And when we got to the backyard of the house, it was interesting. All the neighbors came, and you had all these ladies, these Ukrainian peasants in these huge, boots, rubber boots, and with a babushka on their heads. They were looking at us, these crazy Americans who've come to see the grave of Rebbe Nachman. And of course, we looked at them in this very funny way, because they were dressed like Ukrainians from the 18th century. So it was an interesting time. But Rebbe Nachman made a promise. At the end of his life, he brought together some of his students, and he made a promise that if you go visit his grave, and if you give charity, and if you say the 10 Psalms that he discovered that were the important Psalms to be said, that he would take you by your payot, and he would bring you into the Garden of Eden, and all your sins would be forgiven on one condition, that you decide to start a new life with a new life and start life fresh. So that's what I did. And so hopefully when I get to the next world, he's going to be waiting for me and take me into heaven.
Perfect. All right, good. All right, let's look at some Rabbi Nachman stories.
Just a quick biography. Rabbi Nachman lived in the Ukraine, and what happened is that he was born in about the year 1772, and he lived to about the year in about the year 1810. He was about 40 years old when he passed away. Actually, passed away from tuberculosis, which in those days was really fatal. When you got tuberculosis. Those years were interesting years because it was the years of the French Revolution, and then of course it was the years of the Napoleonic Wars. Rebbe Nachman was the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, who started Jewish mysticism. And what happened is that he began to teach, and a group of Hasidim began to gather around him. And what happened is that one student who was an incredibly wonderful student, his name was Nathan Sternhartz, he became his secretary. And what he would do is that he would write down Rabbi Nachman's lectures after he gave them. Generally, Rabbi Nachman spoke Rosh Hashanah, Hanukkah, and Shavuot. Those are the three major occasions that he spoke. And so what Rabbi Nassim would do would be to take all this material, and he actually wrote it down. And then afterwards he wrote the stories of Rabbi Nachman down also, so that without Rabbi Nassim, I don't think we would have all the material. Unfortunately, Rabbi Nachman was not popular among the other Hasidic rabbis because he was very radical. And so he was persecuted, and then his Hasidim, after he died, were also persecuted. But as we know, Breslov Hasidim have continued on and become quite a force here in Israel and around the world.
Yes.
There are two great ideas that maybe we can talk about in terms of Rebbe Nachman before we get to his stories. And there are two great ideas. One great idea, I think, is most of us have heard about in terms of Rebbe Nachman, is that Rebbe Nachman said that the goal of life is to be happy. The goal of life is liot b'simchat tamid, right? It's to always be happy. Now, when he spoke about always being happy, he didn't really mean that we should be happy, but what he was very much against is depression. And he felt that a depressed person would not be able to have a proper relationship with God, and he wouldn't be able to have a proper relationship with people who were around him and even with himself. So Rebbe Nachman tried very much to emphasize this notion of simcha, or the notion of joy. If you want, if you can put up the, it says early modern workshop on the top of it. Rebbe Nachman of Breslov is teaching melancholy and joy. Do you got it? Ah, there you go. Okay, let's take a look at the second paragraph. However, he says, however, be aware that depression prevents a person from guiding the mind in the directions that he desires and makes it difficult to compose himself. It is only by means of joy that a person is able to direct his mind where he wants, and in this manner to settle his mind. And then if you take a look at text 2, sometimes when people are rejoicing and dancing, they grasp a person from outside the circle, one who is sad, and press him against his will into the circle of dances, and force him to rejoice with them. It is the same with joy. For when a person is happy, his depression and suffering stand off to the side. But the higher level is to struggle and to pursue that very depression, and to bring it also into the circle, so that one's sorrow and woes will flee on account of joy. So what Rabbi Nachman is, I think, trying to say is that joy is for us as human beings is a mindset, and that mindset is that we really have to attempt to have a very positive attitude in life itself. And you and I know that it's very difficult sometimes to have a very positive attitude towards life. Sometimes much easier to see the darkness which is around us and to be depressed, to see the glass which is half full, right, half empty. And so what Rabbi Nachman is saying is that what we have to see in terms of life itself, we have to see life with the glass half full. And what we have to attempt to do is to dispel the sadness which is around us, and to dispel the melancholy that we sometimes feel, and the anxiety really that we feel when we are in the midst of living life. Life is never easy. The circle of life is never easy. And so what Rebbe Nachman is saying is that you have to be pulled into the circle of joy, and that circle of joy is not easy always to find. It's reported, by the way, that in the Warsaw Ghetto, that over the synagogue of the Breslovers, they had a sign, and that sign said in Yiddish, "Jews never despair." And that's, I think, the message of Rabbi Nachman. Rabbi Nachman's message is never despair. Even with the worst things that could potentially happen to us, we should never despair. We should always have a positive attitude. And Rabbi Nachman used to love to walk in the park. And there's a beautiful park, by the way, in Uman, where he lived at the end of his life, and he walked, and there is a path. And today you go on that path of the, in the park in Uman. And in that, of course, on that path is are small bridges over the water which runs through the park. And Rabbi Nachman said when he was going over one of those bridges, he realized Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar mi'od, that all of life is like a narrow bridge, and we never should be afraid to cross the bridge, because most of us stop in the middle of the bridge and we're afraid to cross. And what Rabbi Nachman says is, you got to get to the other side, and you have to try to be positive about life itself. And that's why the great songs which we have from Breslov, Liot b'simcha tamid, always to be happy. And there's a small branch of the Breslovers which we call the Na group, because there was a dream in which one of the rabbis had a dream of Rebbe Nachman, in which Rebbe Nachman said, if you say Na, Nach, Nachman, Nachman mi Uman, then what's going to happen is that life is going to get much easier. So that's the first thing I think about Rebbe Nachman, and that I think really caught my imagination. The second thing, the second great idea, which I think we have about Rabbi Nachman, is called hitbodedut. Now, generally, when we think about meditation, right, what happens is that we immediately move to the Buddhist tradition or the Hindu tradition and say, oh, yeah, meditation is a Far Eastern phenomenon, right? It belongs to people from the Far East. That's where everybody meditates. And rarely do we understand that meditation is also a force in Jewish life, too. There are very ancient techniques that we have about meditation. One of the most ancient, by the way, techniques that we have about meditation is that we try to feel our breathing. And if you want someday, just sit on a quiet chair someplace and just listen to yourself breathing. And you recognize that God gave us the breath of life. That's the first thing that he did. He gave us the breath of life, which made us alive as human beings. And so what we want to do is that we want to get in contact with our breathing and with the breath of life, which is ours. And then, of course, the second aspect of meditation is to try to think about your life and to try to think about something. First of all, to try to think about something that you think is important. So one technique which I think from the Jewish tradition comes up is that what we try to do is that we try to concentrate, let's say, on the words of the Shema. And so what we would do is that on the words of the Shema, we would intake on the word Shema, and then we would exhale on Yisrael. And the intake on Hashem, and then exhale, Elokeinu. Inhale, and then exhale on Hashem Echad. Then keep doing that, and you'll find that it's a very interesting technique in which you really, after a while, you get into the rhythm, and it's something which is beautiful. Rabbi Nachman had revived the idea of hitbodedut, he called it, of meditation. And what he said is that everybody should choose a wonderful place that he liked. A lot of the Breslovers, like Rebbe Nachman, like to go out to a forest, like to go out to a secluded spot. Him and Judy and I were once in a taxi on a Saturday night, here in Yerushalayim. We were going someplace, and on the radio to the cab driver came a message over the short wave saying to him, "There's a group of Breslovers that want to go to the Jerusalem forest. Do you have time to take them to the Jerusalem forest?" And here you had a group of Breslover Hasidim that went to the Jerusalem forest. Each one took his own tree and started what's called hitbodedut. Everybody can do it any place. You just have to find a comfortable spot. And then you begin by, first of all, thinking about what blessings that God has given you and to be thankful for the blessings which we have from God. It's an interesting story about two angels. One angel, by the way, had a huge bundle on his back, and the second angel had a very small bundle. And somebody asked the one angel and said, "How come you have such a big bundle?" And his answer was, "These are all the prayers which I'm taking up to heaven for God to answer." And then they looked at the other one and they said to him, "Why do you have such a small package?" He said, these are the words of thanks that people have given after God has granted their wish." Right? So again, Rabbi Nachman says you got to think about all the good things of life, and then you got to review what your life itself, and then after you review your life itself, you really have to think more clearly about where do you want your life to go. And he suggests that you do it every night in the evening, because in the evening it's generally quiet. He didn't live during the coronavirus, and where even the mornings and the afternoons are quiet. But according to him, it was really at night. So I'll tell you what, when you if you can put up where it says the essential Rebbe Nachman, should be the third sheet. Great. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, 108, 109, 110, 111, 112, 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, 118, 119, 120, Okay, so he says, you should, in the second paragraph, you should hold these conversations with God in whatever language you speak best. Our set prayers are said in Hebrew, but if this is not one's native language, it's difficult to use it to give expression to one's innermost thoughts and feelings, and the heart is less drawn after the words. It is easier to pour out your heart and say everything that you need in your own language. You should tell God everything you feel, be it contrition and longing, to repent over the past, or requests and supplications to come truly close to God from now on, each person according to his level. So that is, I think, one of the main teachings which we have of in Breslov, which is to do hitbodedut, to try to do it every day. Not always easy to do it every day, but it's a good thing to try to meditate and to do it at important occasions of your life.
All right.
So those are the two ideas.
Thank you. All right, let's go to the stories. I saw you had the Turkey Prince, which is one of my favorite stories.
Yeah, right.
Maybe let's not start with that one. I'll start with a different one. Yeah. What else we got?
Okay, so you want to do the tainted grain?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do the, and around the year 1810, Rebbe Nachman turned to his student, Rebbe Nachman, and said to him, I'm going to stop teaching, I'm going to start telling stories. Rebbe Nachman looked at him like he was crazy. You're a Rebbe. Rebbes teach. They don't tell stories. So, no, Rebbe Nachman says, I'm going to tell stories, but I'm going to tell wondrous stories. Stories that you've never heard before. Stories that are different in terms of, different than anybody else in the world has ever told. And so most of his stories, by the way, are based on Jewish mysticism. The longer stories, there's a number of very long stories. They're all based on Jewish mystical literature. And what he tried to do is to weave mystical literature into the story so that people would get an idea of what Jewish mysticism was all about, and then discuss it discuss it together. He has a number of very long stories, and then he has a number of very short stories. So what I've done is I've taken some of the shorter stories, because the longer stories you really do need a long time to analyze them, because they're really based on the Zohar, and they're based on Jewish Kabbalistic thinking, and many of them are really difficult. The story of the tainted grain is a very interesting story. A king once told his prime minister, who was also his good friend, I see in the stars that everyone who eats from this year's grain harvest is going to go mad. What do you think we should do? The prime minister suggested that they should put a stock of good grain away so they would not have to eat from the tainted grain. But it is impossible to set aside enough good food, good grain for everyone, the king objected. And if we put away a stock for just the two of us, we will be the only ones who will be sane. Everyone else will be mad. And they will look at us and think that we are the mad ones. No, we too will have to eat from this year's grain, but we will both put a sign on our heads. I will look at your forehead, and you will look at mine. And when we see the sign, at least we will remember. Very interesting story. It's once again, madness is one of the themes that runs through Rebbe Nachman's literature. If you take a look, by the way, at the stories of Eli Wiesel, Eli Wiesel bases most of his stories on Rebbe Nachman. A lot of the stories have, in all of the stories, there's always a madman. As an example, one madman, as an example that he has, is a story he tells that after the Holocaust, there was a young man who was in a mental institution in Siget, which is the city that Eli Wiesel came from. And Eli Wiesel went back to Siget, and he went to the mental institution, and he met with this young man. And he said to the young man, tell me, why are you mad? Why do people think you're crazy? So the young man said to Eli Wiesel, I'll tell you why people think I'm crazy. He said, you know what happened? What happened was I went back to my town. I went back to Siget. I went back to the synagogue, and there was nobody in the synagogue. I went to the Beit Midrash. There was nobody in the Beit Midrash. And then I went to the marketplace, and there were no Jews in the marketplace. And then I started knocking on doors. And the places that all my friends were, there were no more Jews in those houses. They were all Ukrainians and Romanians at this point. So he said, people started to think that I'm crazy, because how could it be? Where did the Jews go? What happened to the Jews, right? So this idea of the madman, it runs throughout Jewish prophetic literature. Then, of course, it runs into the stories of Eli Wiesel. And in this case,
it means that the world, I mean, the commentary here, I think, is that the world is crazy. The world is madness at some level. Is that what that means?
Yeah. The idea is that, first of all, the madman speaks the truth, right? It's always the madman, because only people who are mad speak the truth. People who don't speak the truth are those who conform. And the conformists don't always speak the truth. They speak the talk, right? Whatever that talk is, they walk the talk, right? Whatever that talk is supposed to be. But the madman, he's the one who really tells the truth. He tells the truth of the world in which we live. And we always think of them as being mad. So this is what the story is here. The story is, and it's based, by the way, on, if you in a part of the ritual that we have, one of the rituals that we have on for Hoshana Rabbah, is that we have certain verses that we say, and we pray each year for good rain. We pray each year for good crops. We pray for everything good. And one of the things we pray for is that the grain should not be tainted, so that we don't go mad by eating the grain. And there is, by the way, some truth to this, because there is some rust that sometimes gets onto the grain, and it really does produce some crazy experiences for people. But here, what you see with the two of them is that they're living in the world of madness, and they too are mad like everybody else. The only thing is they recognize that they're mad, right? And so this is, I think, what Rebbe Nachman is trying to say about you and I. We live in a world which is mad, right? We live in a world which is, look at what we're going through now. It's a world which is topsy-turvy, which is crazy, right? And
he gives us a glimpse into his mind, which I think has a bit of madness in it. And
yes.
So I guess Janice asked, did he struggle with madness? Did he struggle holding it together at times, mentally and emotionally?
The person who wrote probably one of the more definitive biographies of Rebbe Nachman is Rabbi Arthur Green, and he wrote a book which is called The Tormented Master, in which he tries to show that Rebbe Nachman really was bipolar. He had moments of great insight, and then, of course, he had moments he was acted childishly, right? Mm-hmm. So he felt that Rabbi Nachman really did have depression, bipolar, and so he was really fighting madness. And that story really sort of is an autobiographical, right? Autobiographical story about his life.
Beautiful. And there are strategies that he uses, which is song and dance,
right.
and music, surrounded himself with musicians.
Yes, music was very important to him. Singing was very important to him. At the end, by the way, of every service in the Breslov Shul, people get together in a circle, and they sing and they dance and they clap, right? Because that's what Rebbe Nachman wanted people to do. The dancing to him is something which was holy, right? And he once pointed out that on Simchas Torah, when you and I hold the Sefer Torah, we become the resting place, we become the stand, we become the witnesses that this Sefer Torah is something which is holy, and something which is to be cherished and to be given from one generation to another generation.
Beautiful. And Yeah. All right. Let's go to the next text. Yeah.
Okay. The next story is a extremely interesting story. There's a lot of stuff that's been done with the story, by the way, on a number of levels. We'll talk maybe about it afterwards. But the idea of the rooster is a very interesting. If you look around, by the way, in literature, if you look around at great literature and also some interesting art, you'll find a lot of the Jewish artists have used the rooster as a way in which they portray, one of the great ideas of the Breslov tradition. We have a friend who collects roosters, rooster art, and his whole house is filled with pictures and with Brith here who lived with us in Wilson Towers, and his house is filled with all art which is really around roosters. So the parallel story. The story is a very interesting story. So let's take a look at the parable and see what we can do with it. Okay. He says there was once a prince who lived with his father and mother, the king and the queen. Now, whenever you have the king and the queen, or you have father and mother, this is referring to God, who is the king, and the queen is the Shekhinah, the female aspect of God. So in a splendid fashion, and received the finest education and upbringing. To his parents' chagrin, one day the prince went through an identity crisis and came to the conclusion that he was really a turkey and not a human being. Initially, the king and queen thought he was kidding. However, after he stopped joining them at the royal table and instead moved under the table and sat there naked and pecking at crumbs, they knew that serious trouble was afoot. Needless to say, the prince's strange behavior caused indescribable angst for his loving parents and intense embarrassment for the royal family at large. The king was ready to spare no expense for the person who could cure his son. The finest doctors and psychiatrists of the land came and tried to cure the prince, but to no avail. The king was at a loss until a gentle-looking wise man came to the palace. I hereby offer to cure the prince free of charge, declared the man. My only condition is that no one interferes with anything that I do. Intrigued and desperate, the king and queen readily agreed. The following day, the prince had company under the table. It was the wise man. What are you doing here? Said the turkey prince. Why are you here? Countered the man. I'm a turkey, responded the prince emphatically. Well, I'm also a turkey, the man replied. And with that, he began to gobble like a turkey and peck at the crumbs on the floor. And the prince was convinced, and a few days passed in this fashion. One morning, the wise man signaled to the king to bring him a shirt. He said to the prince, I don't see any reason a turkey can't wear a shirt. The prince thought about it and agreed. And soon the two of them were wearing shirts. Soon the wise man asked to be brought a pair of pants. He said to the prince, is it forbidden for turkeys to wear pants? Certainly not. The prince thought it over and agreed. And soon the two of them were wearing pants. So the process continued. Shortly thereafter, the wise man convinced the turkey prince that it was not forbidden for turkeys to eat human food, which was surely tastier than the crumbs. Then came to sitting at the table and enjoying human conversation. Within a short term, the turkey prince, though still maintaining that he was a turkey, began conducting himself exactly as a regular person. The story itself, by the way, is a very interesting story. The story is also the idea of using a turkey or using an animal is also very interesting. Franz Kafka, who built a lot of his stories also on Rebbe Nachman, just like Elie Wiesel built his stories on Rebbe Nachman. He also speaks about, if you take a look, he also has a number of animals that he talks about. Most of them are insects, because he was more deeply depressed than Rebbe Nachman. But the idea here is, on several levels, and we'll talk about one level, which is that this is this is a memorandum to teachers, that every student, every child has to be treated individually. Every child is a human being. Every child is a person. Every child has challenges. And every child has to be treated in a way that's going to be appropriate for that child. Most teachers, as we know, teach to a class. They don't teach to individuals. And I think what the story is telling us, that as educators, you really have to try to teach to the student and not necessarily teach to the text, right? We all know that many teachers teach the text, but that doesn't really do anything for the student. If you really want to educate and make sure that a student learns, it has to be something which is internalized by the student. And that can only be done if you talk to the student on his level. The second level, of course, is the level of social work and psychiatry, right? In social work and psychiatry, right, what you have to do is that you have to get to the level of the patient. You have to see the patient as a human being. And you can't see the patient simply as a patient. You have to see the patient as a person. This is what Martin Buber called the I-thou, right? The I-thou relationship is that you see another person, another human being as a real being, right? As a real person. And that what you then attempt to do is, of course, to deal with the person on the level that the person needs, right? You have to try to find out what are the needs of the person. And you have to try to internalize what are the needs of that person.
You can only impact the person if you have a genuine relationship with them first. Okay, yeah.
And just the last thing is, when we talk, as I said, in most stories, when Rebbe Nachman speaks about father and mother, he speaks about God and the Shekhinah, or he speaks about levels of understanding of God. And the person that we're dealing with here is the ordinary Jew. Right, the ordinary Jew, you and I, the ordinary, run-of-the-mill Jew, right? The simple Jew. Rabbi Nachman loved the simple Jew more than anybody else who had simple faith. And we see here that, unfortunately, what you try to do is that you take the simple Jew and you try to mold him and form him into a way that you think that Judaism really wants. You have your idea of what Judaism wants, and you try to make this other person conform to what your idea of Judaism is, right? And lots of times what happens is that people run away, We have all those wonderful films now and books about men and women who've, let's say, left the Hasidic community because they find that it's too tight. It's find that it's too overbearing. And it makes sure that you are a part of a convention, right? That you dress the right way, you think the right way, that there's right thinking, there's right dressing, right? And what Rabbi Nachman, I think, is telling you at this point is that every Jew has to be taken on his own level, right? And every Jew has to respond to God on his own level. There's not one response to God. There are many responses to God, and each one of us has to respond in the way that's appropriate for him. Right. And so when those people sometimes become turkeys, right? When they leave the Jewish tradition and they decide to, become a part of the larger world, then I think that we have a responsibility, just like the wise man had a responsibility to reach out, to get under the table, and to talk to somebody, and then to bring him back to the Jewish tradition. Because I think that's a very crucial aspect of being a member of the Jewish people, is to make sure that all of us, right, are members of that people, no matter what we believe and what conventions we're willing to accept.
Right. When I teach this text with some of my high school students, we get into I lead a conversation around behaviorism, meaning it doesn't, right? What really matters is that he's behaving like a human being, not what he feels or thinks.
Correct.
So that's interesting. Like, did he cure? The question I posed to the kids is, was he cured or not? The answer is not really, but he's still behaving. Like he's a part of the world and able to connect and get along, even though he might be mad. He might have madness inside of him, like Rebbe Nachman seems to have had. And we all have some of that. We all have some of those
Right.
moments of madness, I assume.
So I think
things just don't fit together.
I mean, in the larger stories, of course, you know, run pages and pages, and they really are, you know, very, very intense, and you really have to think about them you really have to think about them on a lot of different levels. So these are some of the easiest stories, and there are a number of really, really, very beautiful stories, short stories that he has.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for your introduction to Rebbe Nachman and developing your connection with him for us, and for teaching us a little bit about his text and his shita. Any kind of last words about your connection with Hasidism in general? I mean, last time you talked about intellectualism. In what ways do you have some Hasidism in your Yiddishkeit?
Okay. Well, just a couple of things. First of all, you know that the Hasidic tradition provides us with an alternative to the general traditions in which most of us have been brought up in, right? And so I think it provides us with a sort of understanding, a different kind of understanding of God, a different understanding of what it means to develop a personal relationship with God. Most of us, you know, you know, we're very happy to keep Shabbat and to put on tefillin and to do all those, you know, Jewish rituals, but it's much harder to really find God in the, you know, in those rituals, and to really attempt to develop a personal relationship with God. The second thing that I think that the Hasidic tradition reminds us about is that the world is really a sacred place, and that we have to look in the world, and as we look at the world, we have to look at it with a sense of awe, right? When we eat bread, as an example, we make the blessing Hamotzi Lechem in Haaretz. It's not simply that we're just saying a few words. What we're doing is that it's a moment of awe for us. Here I take this piece of bread and I think about, do you remember, look at this bread. It needs wheat to grow. And for that wheat to grow, it needs good soil. It needs rain. It has to be nurtured by a farmer. And then, of course, it has to be cut and winnowed, and then you get flour. And then the flour has to go to a bakery. And there's a baker that makes this wonderful bread. And we all know that that smell of bread is just a wonderful smell, right? You hear that. And then you go to the store and you have money and you're able to buy the bread, right? And then you're able to have this piece of bread in front of you. And then you say to yourself, you make this blessing. With this blessing, you say to yourself, really, there's so much that went into this making of this bread. I really thank you, God, for the awe which this inspires within me. So that's the second aspect, that the world itself is a sacred place, and that the world itself is holy, and every aspect of the world is holy. We just have to search and to find really the holiness in the world. And the last thing is that I think many of us have been brought up in, I'm going to be a little negative if you don't mind. Most have been brought up in either modern Orthodox synagogues, where God forbid you should speak in the synagogue, right? And everything has to go, right? You get there at 8 o'clock. I mean, for most of the synagogues here in Israel, you get there at 8 o'clock, you got to be out by 10 o'clock. Sure. If you're not out by 10 o'clock, half the congregation is at the door already, right? So
precise ritual precision.
Everything is ritualized, right? And God forbid the rabbi should speak more than 7 minutes, and that's it. And then, of course, Friday night, if the rabbi speaks, everybody, of course, takes a nap during the time the rabbi speaks. But basically, in many conservative synagogues, not Brith Shalom, but in most,
Yeah.
but in many synagogues, worship, really, davening is ritualized, right? The rabbi's up there at page 7, page 23, everybody stand, everybody sit, and there's no meaning to the tefillah, right? There's no meaning that comes from the tefillah. The only thing that you do is just have the ritual. I once, I shouldn't talk about it, but once my grandson and I were in a conversation, and he was looking at me, and he said to me, you know, we got to hurry up, because Kiddush is at 7:28 tonight, and we gotta make Kiddush at 7:28. And because I looked at him and I said to him, "What happens at 7:29? What happens at 7:23? God is not listening. God only listens in the small window at 7:28. He doesn't listen before or afterwards." So this is what I think. I think what the Hasidic tradition is trying to tell us, right? Now, sometimes they go off overboard, but I think it's really to tell us that the emphasis on ritual is good. I mean, it's important, but the emphasis on the inner life of the Jew is the most important thing. And I think we have to really deal with the inner life of the Jew and to try to make sure that we really are concerned about the inner life of the Jew. Rabbi Mendel of Kotsk, who was again another very radical Hasidic master, once said, one of the students said, "Rebbe, where is God?" And his answer was a very interesting answer. His answer was, "God is wherever we let him in." Right? So all of our life, based on Jewish mystical tradition, is we have to let God into our lives.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for sharing your complex relationship with both intellectualism and Hasidism. And I heard another topic come up at the beginning. What was that topic? Literary analysis in the Torah. Yeah. Beautiful.
And once again, I want to emphasize that, don't forget, I'm coming from Yerushalayim, Yer HaKodesh, the holy city of Yerushalayim.
Yes.
And it's just a miracle to be able to live here in Yerushalayim. Rebbe Nachman, by the way, one day he came out of the mikveh, he looked at his wife and his 6 children, and he said to them, "Guys, I'm leaving." And they asked him, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going to Israel." And he actually went to Israel. And then when he got back from Israel, he said, "Every step that I take, every place that I go, I'm on my way to Israel." So that's what I want to tell people. You should be on your way out of the coronavirus, on your way to Israel.
Every step. L'shana haba, Yerushalayim haba. Thank you very much. Let's open it up and send regards. Uncle Herbie? Herbie's here. Where's Herbie?
No, where's Uncle Herbie?
Yeah. Herbie, say hello.